Welcome, everyone. Today, I've got Roger Thisdell with me again for some conversation. If you've seen our previous conversation, you'll know about Roger and the work that he's up to, so I won't repeat all of that here. But welcome you to check all that out. What I wanted to do with this time with Roger today is really explore a couple more topics in detail, maybe get some insight and some guidance for particular praxis points, issues around potential helpful aids and ways of going about a meditative practice that might be more efficacious for folks. Part of this is born out of my own just sort of personal desire to, I feel a bit stuck where I'm at in exploring a meditative practice. And I was very inspired by my conversation with Roger and feeling like I could draw on some of his insights for some pointers on, maybe a new direction or new ideas to bring into my practice that could be helpful. And so as we were talking about this, we thought, well, this could be more broadly helpful for folks. So why not just do it as another conversation and put it up, and hopefully there's something of value here for folks besides me. I'll be sort of a guinea pig maybe, and we can talk about all sorts of things about practices and where my phenomenological sense of self is at, and where what my motivations are for trying to alter or transform that, et cetera, et cetera. But so that's sort of all by way of an introduction. That said, welcome, Roger, and thanks again for joining me for some conversation.
Cool. Good to be back talking with you. And so I mean, we were actually talking quite a bit beforehand. We had bouncing lots of ideas off of each other about what this could be. So part meditation guidance session to help you progress along your journey, and part message to a broader audience to help them. And sort of, I was inspired by your conversations with Layman Pascal and John Vervaeke on the religion that's not a religion, and you guys were talking to some points about human development projects, call it that, in a way that promotes the flourishing of everyone, that has transparency, that develops deep trust among people. Noticing, I mean, these are some of the points I picked up, how roles can change. At some point you're the student, at some point you're the teacher, and that's flexible and is reciprocal learning. So I mean, again, like I said, I'd like to start with first asking you, how would you describe where you're at in your meditation journey? What are your main questions in a way that then, my mind can meet your mind. I can kind of see more your point of view,
right?
And then help you to come see my point of view from this fourth path, enlightenment, centerlessness, whatever we call it, and then maybe perhaps we'll experiment with having kind of a meta conversation over the top of this, talking about some of those ideas that you were speaking to with Layman Pascal and John Vervaeke.
Yeah, so definitely. So great. All right, where I'm coming from is So without getting into the full life trajectory here, but just some brief little spark notes. I come from a Christian tradition, raised in an evangelical context. So was sort of very interested in religion and spirituality from a very early age. And that has undergone a series of transformations as I've gone through my own process of development and thinking about what this means, and kind of framing that more in terms of, say, a Paul Tillich kind of sense of ultimate concern, what's ultimately of value and worth and importance, to the point where I'm very much, I feel, what's the word, sort of distance from where I originally began these sorts of interests and passions, to a new place where I'm locating the work that I feel that needs to be done much more internally, in the sense that as I've tracked sort of my sense of what is of ultimate concern, it's sort of transitioned from a kind of relationship to a deity to a sense that that deity isn't so separate, but is actually part of everything, and I am part of that, to now a sense that maybe even this deity is in some ways a deep projection of something fundamentally internal. And as I've read more mystical literature from a number of different traditions, been deeply inspired and called to explore my own capacities for direct experiential communion or unity with that ultimate reality. And so for me, as I've explored meditation, it seems like that is sort of the psychotechnology that can afford those sorts of experiences, which are transformative of my sense of identity and hopefully would provide me an insight into the nature of myself at its most deep foundational level, which in turn, I think I am presuming and assuming that would be a revelation about the nature of reality itself. That would be one way of phrasing it. So as I progressed in sort of this way of thinking, picked up a meditation practice, and the one that has sort of I've most engaged with, though I've never had a teacher of a particular, I've never done like regular teaching engagements or anything like that with a teacher. But I did find the work of Lee Bracington and his jhanas. So we talked a little bit about that in our previous conversation. And one of the things that I was deeply interested in there, which is what introduced me to the idea that meditation was basically, it was more than what I'd assumed it to be, which is, I can get centered and I can feel calm and more restful. But actually that this is a psychotechnology that can basically alter your state of consciousness to such a radical degree that it is radically transformative and mystical. And so I pursued the kind of jhana approach that Bracington writes about in his book, and I felt like I was able to sort of track a little bit with some of those particular, stages, I guess you'd call them, of a meditation practice. But I feel like it didn't really do anything ultimately transformative in the way that I was seeking. I've been able to get into very deep, calm states. I've been able to, I have a Muse headband, which I was excited about to see, maybe this will help in terms of being able to put some objective correlative data to my internal subjective experiences in order to help guide that process better. And I've seen shifts that occur in my brain states, but ultimately it's one of just deep calm. And I'm looking for something beyond that. And I feel like calm is great, but where's this whole unia mystica thing? Where's the transformative revelation of my deep self and that union with the ultimate, or something like that, right? So that's my goal. And I feel like what I've been doing hasn't really been getting me there. Maybe it's a path or a part of the journey that still needs to deepen or whatnot. But when I learned about you and your experiences that you've talked about and sort of your new default phenomenological state of mind, I felt like this is fascinating. This seems to be what I am trying to bring about in my own experience. And so, so I was then really deeply interested that you'd been doing jhana meditation, but then kind of use that as a springboard for something else. And so I thought, well, I'm looking for that something else. So how do we get there? So I don't know. That'd be my first pass at some of that.
Good. Well, so what I realize is, I think there's some things you just said that helped me understand more how you see the big project and such. One thing it would be good to touch on is, your language of a communion with a god, or the divine or something, which still perhaps suggests quite a big degree of a reifying of some thing, objectifying of a thing. And what I found too, and what Buddhism talks about, the inside emptiness, you stop reifying anything, everything. Like there's no thing, there's nothing to contact, there's no object to get closer to, there's no two objects to merge.
Can I yeah, so that's really, I want to throw this also in there. There seem to be in conversations about non-duality, which is ultimately an experience of non-duality, is what is I'm inspired to have and what I'm seeking to experience. But what non-duality is and how it's been conceived has been differently expressed. So there is, on one hand, especially in more of the kind of Christian tradition, there's like the union with the divine and sort of the beatific vision and seeing the face of God and whatnot, which is sort of still very theological and, subject, having experience of an other, etc. There's also then the kind of more unity experience of that sort of ecstatic oneness. That seems to be another kind of sense of non-duality. But then there's the non-duality that you've talked about, which is sort of a living, perpetual state of non-separation with experience or something like that. And so these strike me as somehow related. I don't know how, but just to clarify, it's not necessarily that my end goal here is just, the grand shining face of God experience. It's whatever yeah. I mean, that would be great. Time, forever. Yeah. I mean, hey, if that's possible, whatever, but whatever that non-dual experience is, yeah. So that's part of what needs to be clarified, I think, probably for me a little bit.
And then I think even to bring it back down to earth, like, what is the goal here? Why do we care about it? Why do you care about having a non-dual experience? And I think ultimately because it feels good, or you suffer less when that's happening. And if it didn't do that, you wouldn't care about it. Like, I think the real deep motivation for any of this work is I just don't want to suffer. I want to suffer a lot less. I may just, as we do this as well, like I want to speak to like different parts of your mind. So you might have like a really broad conceptual overview of the grand project here. You reflect on your life. How has my spiritual journey been? And then that's like there's like the remembering self. It's different forms of self. But then just like come down to like this moment, like really, like, and I'd encourage you, like, this moment, how would you describe your experience? If you look with your attention, can you find or point to the sense of the duality or the boundaries and in space?
Okay, so I feel as though I am centered, to use a kind of word that you use, as a self agent that I usually locate around here, because this is where my sense organs are, eyes and ears and everything. Perfect, so most of the kind of sensory information and inputs coming in here. And so I feel like an agent operating in a three-dimensional, ultimately four-dimensional space-time. And that there's sort of an outside and there's an inside. I feel like I don't have control over the outside. It's not up to me what happens. It's like and then of course I won't get into the narrative framings of why that seems to make sense, but there seems to be like,
so avoid that subtle slippage there.
Yeah. So it feels like two things actually are possible when I start thinking about this. And there can be a shift here, which is interesting. So there's one sense in which, there's this stuff out here and I'm relating to it and I'm sort of mapping it, but I don't perceive it as a map. It's so real, it's so convincing that most of the time I completely forget, oh, I just have sense organs that are mapping information or whatever. I'm going through the world. When I start to think about it, now maybe that's what you're saying we should bracket, but the thing is, when I think about it differently, my sense of experience can shift, right? So for example, if I'm sitting down and I'm like, okay, wait a second, this is all mapped in my mind, and that all the experiences that I'm having are internal experiences. Well, now everything's shifted in the sense, in a way that it's internal. And I can sit with that a little bit and I can be like, oh, this is what feels like is out here is in here. At the same time, my whole sense of out here, in here is coming from my mapping of myself in relationship to my environment. So that's about as far as I can get to like internalizing reality and thinking about, oh, this is an internal kind of phenomenal experience. But then that's kind of where it ends. And I also don't really see much to come from that. In some ways, it could potentially even be sort of, solipsistic or pathological or something if it goes too far, of like everything is just in here. So anyway, that would be sort of how I would explain my experience. And so when I hear other forms of sort of an epistemic agent being described that don't cohere with that, I'm deeply intrigued, and want to know, because I don't think this is it. I don't think this is the ultimate real thing. And so I want to, shift that a bit.
Yeah, that's well, I think that's good that I mean, it sounds almost like you're able to think your way into a different perspective. Is that how you describe it?
Yeah, I think that it feels like if I can begin to conceptualize things differently, then I can start to feel a phenomenological shift of like, oh, that's really interesting. I mean, if you do a thought experiment and you tell someone, hey, basically just give them Kant, and be like, hey, actually, there's like a thing in itself that we're never really even able to experience, because we're just mapping the sensory world, internally and all this stuff. And that's all that we're ever actually engaging with is the phenomena. There's sort of like a moment that I think can happen. And so there is a sort of revelatory knowledge that I think can shift that frame of awareness. But maybe a conceptual, rethinking isn't the mode into this sort of a thing at all. And maybe there's a different way in.
Well, I think it gives at least potential in the beginning. If you can reliably make that perspective shift happen, and maybe you do it through a kind of thought process, okay, but then pay attention to how the feeling quality changes, how you're using your attention differently to get into that altered perspective, and then see if you can do it without the conceptual overlay on top. And then can you hold it? Is that could be a kind of practice. Okay, I'm going to try and, my practice is hold this view of everything is a qualia, everything is in the mind. You flagged very wisely, yeah, there's danger for a solipsistic viewpoint there, and be careful of that. But yeah, I recommend like try to play with that, hold with that. And I think this is part of the process, is to notice the malleability of perspective phenomenologically, such that the default model, the model that everything's, there's this inside and then outside, it gets juxtaposed with this other model. And if you can do it so back to back, it just calls into question, well, the default model, is it really the default model? And I think perhaps the mind then sort of starts questioning, and then your default model could shift to another model.
Well, it's almost like sort of toggling back and forth between sort of idealism versus empiricism or something like that, right? I mean, it's just a nature of my personality that I'm highly conceptual. So these things are sort of helpful heuristics, because obviously you don't really phenomenologically, well, I was gonna say you don't necessarily phenomenologically feel idealism or empiricism, but actually you do. But anyway, what gets discussed in those two kind of competing frameworks that are seen to be either or? Again, I feel like there's that non-dual reality is that, well, no, they're not. Like the inside is the outside and the outside is the inside somehow. I just don't really exactly understand how.
Yeah. I was, it's funny, I was talking to a friend earlier this morning who's, he's a Buddhist and practices, and we're talking about how, I mean, a lot of, sort of spiritual tradition, it's all about oneness and non-duality, everything's interconnected, dependent origination. But the Buddha actually was had like super like analytical conceptual frameworks for this, like the Eightfold Path and the Three Noble Truths and the 10 fetters, and there's like lists within categories within lists, and you know, all these like subcategories. And so it's not a like, you can totally have that kind of mind, and there's a lot of use to that kind of mind, and I don't think that has to be an impediment to realizing non-duality. And also what I believe I see as well, you were saying, I think phenomenological perception does shape like philosophical viewpoints, and there can be a way in which philosophers are talking past each other because they're having very different experience of the world and calling it something else, and just trying to accurately relate and describe how they see things. Meanwhile, you've got another philosopher with totally different brain chemistry who's seeing things differently. And that's why some are empiricists, some are rationalists.
Yeah, I was really interested. You posted, I think, in that qualia computing group, some pictures of you in a space that was like a mirrored enclosure with a bunch of diamonds sort of in suspension. It looked like Indra's net, basically. And you said
the infinity mirror room.
And you said something like, this is the, well, I forget the exact way you put it, but something like, this is the best representation of this phenomenological state of mind that I've sort of experienced. And so one, I was deeply interested, and two, I found like these aids are helpful. And you mentioned the Vervaeke conversations with Layman and I, and like finding symbols that could be guides and aids for these sorts of shifts would be super helpful. And so I guess a question for you would be like, can you explain what you meant by that, how that does a good job of representing your phenomenological experience? And could you think of other examples that could be helpful to sort of, I know you've used the example of the spider's web, which is a helpful one, but like any kind of symbols or representations that could be a way in are super helpful.
Well, firstly, I mean, I want to say, maybe it's a tall order, but I think humans have this potential. We've got the conceptual mind, we've got the analytical mind, and some people are more pictorial, and images help them. And this stuff these descriptions, they can be of use. The maps can be of use. And at the same time, you want to be able to engage in those material, so words and pictures, but then also notice that those cognitive faculties have their limits, and be able to learn how to downregulate them and shift into a mode of being that's not about thinking in language or mental imagery, and well, how else do you, I guess like a feeling quality, or just a perceptual quality that's less and less filtered by top-down information processing. So then, okay, how do those? So describing this. So I was in this infinity mirror room where like sort of hanging diamonds along the walls, but because
I could probably show a picture of it, so it'll help maybe.
Right? Easier to explain. But it really occurred to me, I was like, this is like my experience. This is how I feel what it's like to be. And it's that in that picture, each hanging diamond represents like a node of experience, sensation here, that's a point of experience. There's experience of air here, sensations, hearing, all nodes of experience, and they seem to be just hanging in their place, known there. And in this room, there's no obvious center because there's mirrors on the ceiling, floor, and the walls. So everything's spreading out in infinite directions. There's no sense of a boundary. I mean, in the wall. I mean, in fact, actually, in that room, it's less good because there is clearly an exit. Like, you know, you
Sure, yeah.
walk into a mirror. But I mean, it was interesting to go into that room. It was in a museum here in Barcelona, and I had that image in my mind for a long time, for months, sort of just feeling this, and I was feeling this, and then that image, yeah, sort of Indra's Net, Infinity Mirror Room, was playing in my mind as a way to try to represent. Yeah, you said, do I have any other images? So I'll just pop this here. I need to draw it, but there's some way I want to describe. I don't know if you've ever heard people talk about like quote, there's like one sense door, like God's sense door to experiencing everything. This is another kind of attainment. And there's like a drawing I'm trying to work on. If I finish it before this comes out, I'll send it to you and you could put it.
That would be awesome. Hey, that would be really cool. We'll put it on the wiki. That would be amazing. See, like this would be super cool if like people sharing experiences represented in symbolic fashion that can be aids to meditation and guides to transformation. It's like that's what it's all about. So yeah, definitely. Even if it's a crude drawn on the back of a napkin or something. But to jump back to the mirrors and the net and all that, it sounds like what you're explaining is sort of like phenomenal reality as a sort of infinite three-dimensional grid in which on each kind of point there's like a node of qualia or a quale or something, and that these sort of map together into a kind of the sense of a certain kind of whole that is organically united in some way. Is that one way of putting that? Not so much.
Even then when you said like the 3D net, there's a way in which like it's kind of impossible to shape, because there's a noticing that the projection of space is a fabrication, and so it's like it's not even 3D. It's like,
well, let me ask you this.
It's not 3D, but
yeah. And again, at the risk of over conceptualizing, but concepts are my aids to meditation in some ways, right? So
well, we'll get into that.
Maybe that's bad praxis, but to think of it in terms of, if there's something to what Kant was talking about this transcendental noumena that we don't have access to, but that we use our sort of categorical modes to shape our sensory experiences of reality, taking that sort of raw data and like filtering it through particular categories, let's say of space-time. Is there something to this in terms of like you're past the categories, you've sort of gotten past the top-down filtration system, and you're just sort of interacting with raw, not quite noumena, because it's still got to be mediated by sensory input, but at least it's not maybe being conceptually confined by sort of the Kantian categories? Is that maybe a helpful way of thinking about it?
Okay, I'm not super cued into what the Kantian categories are, what exactly that means, but I mean, there is there's a something I can do with my attention, in which like I can do it like right now, where there's just no there's no space. There's like but yeah, but I mean, sorry, just what is the value? What is the value here? What am I trying to communicate? I would like to go back to the value to you and,
Sure,
and your
yeah.
practice, and yeah, you say, okay, yeah, Brendan, you can steer this how you want, but you said these conceptual frames are your aid in meditation, and if you're banking too hard on those, it may be that you're neglecting this ability to actually drop those.
Yeah.
And in which case I would then like heavily recommend doing practices that get away from conceptual thinking. So go more into the somatic. So
Yeah.
move your attention into your body and away from conceptual.
Yeah, I mean, so I've done, breath work, just focusing on the breath until the chatter dissipates, falls away into the background, and then finally, more or less, you don't have a thinking mind. You just have breaths, and all the sort of narrative kind of disappears. And so I feel like that's close to sort of non-categorical thinking or non-conceptual thinking, but just sort of being. And and then in those experiences, I mean, my eyes have been closed, but I'll have the sensation that sort of my hands will disappear. And when I did a week-long meditation retreat, it was the most intense experience I'd had doing this, because I felt like basically my whole body kind of disappeared, and I felt this, I don't know, sort of this kind of energetic rush. And so I was sort of sitting in this conceptual, mostly free space, feeling somewhat disembodied and feeling kind of excitedly drawn up in some way, which by describing it that way maybe overstates it a little bit, but like that was more or less how I would describe the phenomenal reality of it. I just say that because and generally speaking, my meditation practice has been non-conceptual, or at least that's, been the aim of it. But then it's sort of like, what I don't know what to do is, then what, right? I can sit in non-conceptual space, but I never shift my phenomenological agentic center or anything like that. And I don't know, I'm just sort of stuck in calmness.
Okay. So to get like really practical, I think, the calmness is just the stepping stone to insight. So when there's too much chaotic emotional content, or so many thoughts, scheming, planning, regrets, and remembering, that gets in the way of the ability to do the insight practice, which is like clearly look at the model. So yeah, so you want to be able to get calm, quiet down the chatter, or at least the chatter can just go to the background. I mean, it's hard to, you have to be on retreat for a long time before like you'll get to a point where there's like no languaging thoughts. But yeah, really, I really think you want to be building your metacognition, building your concentration power and clarity of mind, and then with equanimity. So you do practices to bolster these, and with more more attentional clarity, you can zoom into the more specific detail of of sensations and such. Got a sort of a bigger picture of how you're phase shifting, what's the procedures, what's going on. With equanimity, you're not distracted by the world and your personal baggage and such. And then with these honed cognitive faculties, you do insight practice, you look for where's the sense of self, where's the center, where's the sense of boundaries to the mind, and really point attention. Okay, I feel the boundary here, and so I'm like, with my attention, investigating that boundary.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. So, okay, so let's say you do. I'm sitting there. I've done the kind of, let's say, half an hour work to get calm and reduce the chatter. Well, I guess question, is that enough time to, or well, I guess that's a question too. But let's say I'm in that kind of state of equanimity. Now I turn my attention to my phenomenal experience. And I feel, yeah, there's a Brendan Dempsey agent in my head, a little homunculus man. And then I can try to interrogate the boundaries of that. And then what, I guess, is sort of, maybe I just have to experience that and come back and say, all right, I did that for, I don't know how long would be a good thing. So maybe that would be a good question too. So how long to do that sort of practice before maybe you could move to a new, oh, okay, yeah, when I did that, this happened, and that was really interesting, and I could, then maybe use that as my next stepping stone. Something like that would be a good idea, or no?
So, well, yeah, totally. So I mean, this is a really typical sort of routine is that a lot of people have success with, and how it's actually not quite what I was doing, but I know people who have success with this is an hour a day, at least an hour. You use the first, and in some way I agree, the first half an hour is just warming up. Like, and it's maybe you do a concentration practice the first half an hour to just settle, sort of sharpen your concentration skills, sort of get into the rhythm, and then you could, the second half an hour, start examining, start looking for the self, the homunculus in you. Just you look, and I mean, it can, just take years, for years. I sort of, and for years I was looking at the center point and reducing it and getting it smaller and smaller, and then really home, okay, here's the center, and then seeing it appear, just stops getting represented.
Wait, your audio cut out there for 1 second at a crucial point. So you said you found the center and you made it smaller and smaller, and then you focused on that.
So I really became very familiar. Okay, I've located the center point, like, and I could begin to witness it appear and disappear very, very quickly. So this is another thing I think people need to develop is NPSs, your noticings per second, so that you can see things, phenomenal content appear and disappear sort of very rapidly at a finer and finer grained level, appear and disappear at a rate of like around 3 times per second, which sounds very fast, but it's very doable to build up your noticings per second to notice this kind of frame rate of the mind. I mean, there's things you can notice that are flickering like way faster than that. So it's not actually like superhuman. I mean, that's how quickly it appeared to be flashing for me. And for years, just observing this. And then eventually at some point, it stopped being represented in the mind, the center stopped being represented.
Does that mean that in terms of this, that center flickering in and out, that basically it became full-time flickered out, like it disappeared? Or what do you mean? What was that transition from the self kind of flickering on and off to no longer being represented? What does that mean?
Yeah, basically that. So it full-time flickered out. So like at some point it flickered out and then it never flicked back on. Yeah. So there's something to be said about, well, the right practice at the right time yields the results, and you can't. What the final switch was for me, I don't think will necessarily be the final switch for everyone, and it's not like even you can just recreate the same move now and then you'll get the same results, or there's so much of a journey to go through before this. So I mean, to put that into context, and one thing I see with you, and I really relate to this, is like such a fascination in the conversation, in the conceptualizing of things. And one thing I I feel quite fortunate about is like I get really intellectually stimulated with a lot of these books and these conversations and podcasts, and so there's a nice way in which like my thoughts are very entertaining. Like I can just spend hours just thinking, and it's like a really enjoyable experience actually. But then there's a heavy pull there, which can be distraction, taking away from. Yeah, remember that there's some work to do that's not about conceptualizing things. Although, like we were saying before, in that last moment for me on the jhana retreat, when I was contemplating dependent origination, it was actually quite I was conceptually thinking. There were thoughts, I was sort of visualizing things, and so it's not all bad that there is help there at the right time, the right place, but you also want to be able to drop it. That again, yeah, bring it down to practical terms. You can only pay attention to so many threads at once. And if I were giving someone a prescriptive sort of meditative regime to follow, it's like, let's just focus on a few things to kind of work on. Okay, let's first just like get your concentration skills good, or let's work on increasing your noticings per second so you can perceive phenomena rising and passing at a quicker frame rate. And then trying to find out, okay, which one of these practices is more appropriate for the individual depending on where they're at, and it depends also which stage of insight they're at. So the stages of insight are sort of a model that I follow, that Daniel Ingram has really sort of laid out. Also, Mahasi Sayadaw talks about this in this sort of insight manual. There's these stages you go through where the quality of your attention is different, your emotional relationship to being seems to alter, how easy it is for you to sit, how much motivation you have at any one point. And people recognize it. Yeah, like sometimes I like don't need as much sleep. Other times I'm like exhausted all the time. It's like, why is that? Well, there's many factors, diet and your daily routine, but I think there does seem to be these sort of natural sort of stages of insight that people cycle through. What were some of the other threads? I forgot.
Well, let me continue with that one for a minute. One of the things that, since I've sort of felt like I've stalled with my practice, there's a lot less interest in doing it. So I haven't done it in a while.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I need to get back doing, but it helps to have a sense that I'm kind of doing something again, that it is going to go somewhere. And so this is helpful for that. And so I guess maybe in a very practical question would be, what would be coming from where I'm at, which is, given the background that I've explained, but also in a state where basically I haven't been really meditating regularly for, a couple months, well, maybe a month now. And I know that this sort of regularity and discipline is really important. Do you have any recommendations for, what to be doing so that I feel like?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think this is applicable not just when it comes to meditation, but like learning any skill. Like if you don't see progress and it's not in part enjoyable, just your motivation for it just tapers off dramatically. So that there's a skill in like, how do I keep the fire burning? How do I keep the interest in, and quite frankly, like peak experiences when people are meditating and then something like weird happens, yeah, your sense of the body dissolves. It's like, whoa, that's kind of cool and interesting. That inspires you to keep meditating more. But if that hasn't happened for a long time, then it's like, yeah, I just don't like, what's the point? So I think there's something to talk about incorporating like skillful use of peak experiences. And it's such a delicate subject, but there's perhaps psychedelics might play a role here, although there's the potential for abuse, and you got to remember this is not about a peak experience. It's not about just recreating a peak experience again and again. But certainly, I think in my journey, I was seeing progress quite quickly, and then cool things were happening. I was going on retreat and having, like, I remember getting first jhana the first time, like, whoa, like this is mad, and that's inspiring. I will also say, just living in the century we live in, there might be interesting technology coming out that propels people's practice. I'm a fan of nootropics, and I can't speak about
what are nootropics?
Okay. Nootropics are essentially cognitive enhancing supplements. It's a whole world. There's so many to explore with different safety profiles, and I won't advise anyone to take anything. Just do your research. But like, you meditate better when you feel more awake, when you have more motivation, when you're more concentrated. Like, these are the kind of faculties of mind that help you to meditate better, have more clarity on perception of what's going on, more insight. I think there's something to be said about looking at what supplements we take, or our diet. And so how do we get you motivated again, that you want to sit and meditate more?
Well, yeah. Well, sorry, keep going.
Okay, so yeah, and again, I don't want to overload you. So
go for it.
Be, I know you want it, because I know you find it intellectually stimulating like I do, but actually, for practical purposes, it might not be good. So
sure.
It could be that, yeah, you're just in a particular rut or stage, and just in time, naturally, you will pass through this, and then the motivation will kick in again. Or can we speed up that process where we find a meditation style for you? So one thing I do with my my online meditation group, meditative.dev, is I'm always proposing like new meditation techniques every week, like a different meditation technique, so that people can, in the beginning at least, find a technique that works for them, find a technique that they just have an affinity for, that they find interesting, that they feel good when they do it. That, okay, you try all these different techniques, that one's not really for you. You don't really like noting, you don't really like Vipassana, but maybe you like fire Kasina or metta. And then you're motivated to do it. So I would recommend then, like, let's try and find a practice for you that you find interesting. Well, do you know fire Kasina, for example? Really interesting. So this is you're in a dark room, you're staring at a candle flame, staring at it for like 1 minute, and then you close your eyes and you're left with the after image of the flame, like just called a nimitta, and like a white dot.
Yeah.
And then you peer into, with your eyes closed, you peer into this after image, and you just keep looking at it. And the longer you look, interesting things happen, and this can be very exciting.
That sounds fascinating. That's sort of, yeah. So when I was reading the Visuddhimagga, and where it goes into all the nimittas and stuff, like I briefly tried. I'm like, again, I've been teacherless this entire time, so I'll like read something and be like, oh, okay, that must be. And then I'm like, I must be doing this wrong. But that reminds me of something that I tried from that. But that sounds fascinating. I'll give that a try. I mean, even just knowing that there's something to that, right? Because if you don't know and you don't have any guidance, it's like, all right, I'll just stare at something in my mind and maybe that'll do something. But if there's some good reason to think that it will, that's encouraging.
That's what, for me, that's like one of the deepest questions, is like, how do people figure out this stuff in the beginning? Because if you don't know that there's like something interesting there, if you meditate long enough, then why did the first person stick with it so long? like
Right,
they're
right.
like focusing on their breath, and when you do that for a little bit, like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, no, it's true. Okay, and that's called Fire Casino.
Fire Kasina, and actually,
Casino, oh, Casino, like a disc. Gotcha. Okay. I thought you were saying Fire Casino. I'm like, oh, that sounds
Kasina.
kind of cool.
That's something else. Yeah, you got to go to Vegas for that.
Yeah,
No, this one you can do in your own home. So,
cool.
and actually, as a reference, Daniel Ingram, I believe, co-authored a book with, oh, I forget her name. But the book is just called Fire Casino, I believe, and it's a really interesting short read. It's about a woman who's doing a fire casino retreat, and then Daniel Ingram is coaching her, and it's like their sort of dialogue back and forth as she's going deeper and deeper and deeper into the practice, and really cool stuff is happening.
Okay, awesome. Do you encourage or discourage, especially for someone like me who is very kind of highly conceptual about things, to read a bunch of books? Like, is it better to just stick with a practice and try to focus on the practice? Or do you think that there's a lot to be gained by reading works from Burbea and Daniel Ingram and other people in order to kind of fill out some, because that's the thing, right? It's like, if you know that there's something to a thing and you have an example of that, that's a guide, you're like, oh, I want to do that. But otherwise, if you don't have the inspiration that can come from knowing where these practices can go, it can be demotivating.
Well, I mean, I think for someone like you, you're going to be reading books anyway. Yeah, I mean, even if I were to say, don't read any of these books, you're going to.
Well, I guess I just wonder if there's a danger of sort of having expectations or a goal. I mean, this is sort of this, I always had such trouble with this because people would be like, oh, you just meditate and don't worry about it being anything or going anywhere. Be like, well, that sounds like that sounds, where do I get my motivation to do that at all? There's just all this sense, and I don't personally, I mean, I don't know, there's certainly a truth that if you're trying to push things to happen, then that's going to be counterproductive. But if you go in being like, this can be anything, and as long as I'm just doing it, that's all that matters, never really made sense to me. But at the same time, if you like read a certain book and you're like, okay, this thing is where this leads and this can happen, and then when that isn't happening, then you can have a kind of frustration, or so that would be why I would wonder if maybe not reading those things up front, but sort of progressively maybe falling into them, maybe under the the aegis or the guidance of a teacher who would be like, okay, now that you've gotten there, now go here. Because it's kind of an interesting and kind of unusual thing about our society that we have knowledge available in its entirety, so to speak, and there's no sort of sequential progress that gets made, so that slowly through time things become less and less occluded, and there's something to be said about that way of learning things, rather than just, oh, here's the whole map up front, okay, I must be here and I've got to get there or something. So that was just sort of my potential, the potential problems of reading things up front.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need a more sophisticated understanding of what a human being is. And everything you just said, like, there is room for all those perspectives about, yes, stop thinking and just be, and there's nowhere to go. But also, there is certainly a route of progress to make. And balancing all this, become familiar with those different relationships to being, or inclinations, and feel it. Notice when you're in a striving mind that's propelling you forward. That can be a good thing, and that can also be a detriment at sometimes. But really get familiar, like become, it become obvious. Okay, if you're meditating and you're breathing, how much are you with this breath, or you're subtly leaning into the next breath, expecting the next
Mm,
breath, and become
mm.
familiar with that. And then also, and balancing these, you need both. You need to be able to just be, and to be able to do.
Yeah. The motivation to go back to that issue too for me is and reading Ken Wilber's work has really helped me be able to frame this. It kind of brought a bunch of different pieces I've been mulling over for a long time together in an interesting way, which is that, like, if the process of human beings as they sort of grow is one of increasing self-awareness, so that you're no longer sort of living, or you're no longer seeing the world through something, but you're able to become aware of what you were seeing the world through, right? So if I'm just totally run by my desires and inclinations, and that's what I'm seeing through, then I'm just gonna be blind to what's actually governing me, right? But then if I can step back from that and see, oh, I have these desires and I have them, not I am them, right? And so that step of remove gives me a vantage that I can see, oh, and now I've gained some greater autonomy because I'm not being controlled by those senses, those desires and needs. I'm aware of them, and I think if you follow this process back enough, you kind of get to the point where you're aware of yourself, and then the self is no longer what you're seeing the world through, but there's some way, and I think it's what you're expressing, of sort of like, oh no, that self was another lens. And so when you get past the lens of that centered self, then there's something there, which is what motivates me. It's a mystery. It is at present purely conceptual, because I can think about it, but I haven't experienced it.
Well, and to give you some practical guidance on how to get there, I think what you're talking about is metacognition. And it does seem to be, you can build your metacognition, and then there's at a threshold point in which it, like, you have awareness of the small self, and you no longer feel like super glued to it, and that's the only lens you see through. And okay, how do we build metacognition?
Yeah.
Real simple, the noting technique, where you're labeling things. I'd point people to Shinzen Young's see, hear, feel technique as a really good introduction to noting. That directly builds metacognition, I believe. And then you just keep growing that, building that, building that, building that. And then, yeah, there seems to be a threshold point in which, boop, okay, now you've got like higher order awareness.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. And so that's part of that skill. And so being able to differentiate, like, is building your metacognition basically the same thing as concentration meditation then? Where if, like, okay, yeah. See, like, for me, they feel like the same, right? Because people will always be like, oh, if you grow your concentration, then you'll start to see that you're not your thoughts, right? That you have thoughts. And that's, I feel like, part of that. But then it's sort of like, that's the conclusion. It's like, oh, you have thoughts, you aren't your thoughts. But it's like, well, no, there's got to, okay, yeah. So
yeah. So I mean, this is where I think if things aren't sort of distinguished clearly, yeah, it's all kind of muddled, and it's like, well, what am I actually doing here? And no, metacognition is not the same thing as developing concentration. And the difference, you can be highly concentrated and absorbed into with a particular meditation object, but you're lacking that higher order awareness that, oh, I'm really concentrated right now. You're just really concentrating, you're locked into it, but you don't have this higher order level of knowing this being is very concentrated right now. That's the metacognition. And there's different techniques to build concentration and different techniques to build metacognition. And there's overlap as well. But
yeah, no, that's very helpful.
I just keep to heart, remember the core motivation. For me, it's so clear. My core motivation is I most deeply care about the reduction of suffering for all sentient beings. It's like to keep that in heart along this whole way and balance that with other motivations.
Yeah. Well, it's so part of this for me too is sort of finding myself in a position where I'm a moderator of this Facebook group, and am increasingly having conversations with people who have some influence. I think that if you're going to be trying to help people and trying to alleviate suffering, then you should have some genuine insight into how that can be done and what that looks like in a first person experience, and that there's something potentially duplicitous, it's a strong way of putting it, to if I were to come out and be like, well, I'm Brendan Dempsey and I do metamodern spirituality conversations, but like not really have any deep personal connection with what these insights are kind of revealing and how they can alleviate suffering, then that would be sort of a misuse, I think, of these platforms in some ways. And that's when I think that these things can become just sort of their own thing, that are ego building and that are, oh, I have a project and that gives me a sense of importance and that sort of a thing. So I want to avoid that, which means, which is good. I think it ties in directly with my own individual spiritual aspirations, which are to gain a better sense of reality in order to genuinely help people. For kind of full disclosure, I very much see myself as a seeker in all this, and I wouldn't want anyone to think that I am presenting myself as sort of anything other than that. But I think there's also a kind of exemplary teacherly possibility of sort of co-learning with people, and presenting sort of a model of, hey, I want to know more, I want to grow, I want to develop myself, and then finding people who can help me do that. Hopefully there's sort of, if there is anything kind of that people can take from that. I mean, this conversation, I think, is sort of a good example, which is hopefully like I'm learning a lot from this, and then hopefully in other people being sort of vicariously a part of my learning experience, they are also learning and growing, would be the ideal. So yeah, at the same time, all that said, there is the aspiration to gain the sorts of insight that are helpful, and then be in a position to help spread and share those insights for the betterment of people, which I think is really what spirituality and religion are all about when they're working well. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you said a lot. I guess we probably don't have time to get into all of that, but I think you covered.
Well, and correct me if you feel like there are areas of that are potentially dangerous or misguided or anything like that.
No, I resonated a lot with what you were saying. I mean, the last part, there is this kind of what is it? This sort of a self-validating bias in some way, where we presume our actions and content are justified because the hope is that we just spread the information and the love, and this is helping people. And actually, maybe we need to like really check in, like, actually this could be like a really inefficient method. And not saying it is or it isn't, but it's like you always sort of keeping ourselves in check in that way, and being willing to shift gears when we find out this isn't as helpful as we thought.
Well, the big thing for me, my big sort of axiom and presumption is that starting with a fact, there is such a preponderance of suffering and alienation and despair and nihilism and and degradation in the world today. Fact. That's a fact. My axiom or presumption is that we can't do anything to help alleviate those problems if we're not speaking to the internal phenomenological lived experiences of people in order to reorient that towards a way of being and living in the world and with other people. And so for me, yes, there will be many people, and there are currently, who are trying to change systems and technologies and things like that. And that's so vital. my kind of piece of the puzzle, given what motivates me, what my own personal aspirations and interests are, is trying to put things out into the world that can help with that inner reorientation element. So in some ways, yes, like, it might seem almost absurd, the idea that, hey, what are we going to do about the climate catastrophe? Oh, well, we're going to meditate. Like that seems like a bizarre notion. At the same time, I feel like there's a very direct causal link between the problems in the world and our sort of the way that we're thinking about it. And that's what we need to shift. So that's another big part of it for me too.
Yeah, I've come to a similar conclusion. It's a point that's very hard to transmit, and especially people who are not doing so much sort of inner spiritual growth and such. That, yeah, I've come to a place where I think the most important work is self-transformation, to become the kind of person that's not part of the problem. And that's it's hard to, it's really hard to, because this isn't to deny the importance of political action and stuff, but it's such a tall order, like, because I even think fourth path is not enough. Like, arhatship is not enough. We have to become bodhisattvas. And that requires not just wake up, but clean up, grow up, show up. And that's something I'm still very much working on. And I don't think there can be peace on earth until humans understand themselves much better. We have much more emotional control. We're not suffering. We're not so motivated by fear. And a big part is we know how to communicate with each other. That's so hard, to be able to see other people's point of view and not have malintentions or
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I really believe in the stuff that all these different folks are doing. I think it's like the good work that needs to be done. And I have this sense that there's a growing appreciation and shared sense of urgency about these sorts of things. And I'm just kind of strangely, I'm certainly optimistic isn't the right word, but I'm strangely reassured or something like that there are other folks who are like, yes, this is important, and this stuff needs tending to, and this is what hasn't been tended to, and in part that helps to explain why we're in the situation that we're in. So all that's encouraging. I'm encouraged by that, and I'm interested to be a part of that. We're all grappling with it, and I feel like I think that people who are interested in these, interested is probably too light of a word, but people who feel deeply aspirationally called to spiritually develop can't and won't ignore these sorts of issues. Doesn't mean that anyone's going to be doing them even well, but I think it's part of that broader conversation about, all right, exactly as you were saying, like, well, the waking up part is there, how do we do the cleaning up part, and the showing up part? Yeah, I think that those become that sort of unavoidable additional set of concerns in a sort of bodhisattva engagement with the world. And to me, there's just everything's so interconnected in so many fraught and hard, challenging ways. It's almost, it's seemingly impossible to do that with any ultimate form of integrity, whatever that is, whether that's ever been possible. So anyway, topics and ideas maybe for a future thought, but yeah. Well, my friend, this has been fascinating, interesting, deeply insightful and helpful. I also just appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate you being willing to have this sort of be part of, a broader conversation with invisible participants as well, as it were, in some ways. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. I just well, tomorrow or now, make a dedication to do at least 30 minutes of meditation tomorrow, and then look into fire, Kasina.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.